I've learned over the years that the first lie in any internal security crisis is almost always arithmetic. Numbers are delayed, softened, questioned, and buried, not because analysts lack access, but because institutions lack the will to confront what those numbers imply. When reports began circulating that at least 3,000 Iranians had been killed as anti-regime unrest expanded across major cities, the immediate reaction in Washington was not alarm, but hesitation. Officials stressed confirmation, caveats, and uncertainty, as if the difference between 2,000 and 3,000 corpses altered the strategic meaning of the event. It does not. Once a regime deploys live ammunition against its own population at scale, the exact count becomes morally and strategically secondary. The available reporting made clear that demonstrations were no longer isolated or symbolic. They had spread to Tehran, Isfahan, and other urban centers, and eyewitness accounts described what security professionals immediately recognized as internal warfighting conditions. Protesters were facing organized security forces using weapons of war, not crowd control tools. Communications were cut, internet access restricted, and external verification deliberately obstructed. These are not the actions of a government confident in its legitimacy. They are the fingerprints of a regime that believes survival depends on overwhelming force and information denial. What frustrates me is how often intelligence assessments pretend this pattern is new. It is not. Iran's security services have repeatedly demonstrated that when challenged at scale, they escalate quickly and decisively. The surprise is not the violence. The surprise is that Western policymakers continue to act surprised. By the time casualty figures reach the thousands, the intelligence failure has already occurred. Analysts should have anticipated the response, warned policymakers of likely outcomes, and framed the unrest not as a protest movement, but as a legitimacy crisis with lethal consequences. The strategic consequence of minimizing early indicators is paralysis. When governments treat mass internal killings as an information problem rather than a strategic inflection point, they lose time, credibility, and leverage. Adversaries notice, allies notice. Most importantly, populations under repression notice who is watching and who is calculating excuses. The hard lesson here is simple and endlessly ignored. When intelligence institutions hesitate to name reality because it is politically inconvenient, they become accomplices to narrative fiction, and fiction is a poor substitute for strategy. One of the most reliable indicators of regime stress is not what leaders say, but what they abruptly silence. When Iran imposed widespread internet blackouts as protests expanded, that decision spoke louder than any official statement. I've spent enough time around intelligence reporting to recognize this pattern instantly. Governments confident in their control do not sever communications nationwide. Governments that fear uncontrollable narratives do. Information blackouts are not defensive measures. They are admissions of vulnerability. From an intelligence perspective, cutting internet access serves two immediate purposes. First, it disrupts protest coordination, slowing the tempo of demonstrations and isolating groups that might otherwise synchronize. Second, and more critically, it blocks external verification. Casualty figures, video evidence, geolocation data, and eyewitness testimony become harder to confirm. This creates what policymakers like to call uncertainty, but what regimes rely on as strategic fog. The blackout is not about security. It is about buying time to impose force before accountability can form. What stood out during this unrest was not simply that Iran restricted communications, but how comprehensively it did so. Reports indicated near total shutdowns with only intermittent international connections slipping through, often via satellite systems like Starlink. That detail matters. When citizens resort to external satellite links to describe live fire engagements in urban streets, intelligence professionals should immediately reassess the severity of the situation. This is no longer crowd management. This is internal kinetic suppression. Yet Western intelligence reporting often treats blackouts as technical footnotes rather than strategic signals. Briefings focus on limited visibility instead of explaining why visibility is being limited. That framing subtly shifts responsibility away from the regime and onto the information environment, as if the absence of data is a neutral condition rather than a deliberate act. It allows policymakers to delay conclusions, avoid decisions, and pretend that clarity will arrive on its own if they wait long enough. The strategic consequence is predictable. By the time communications are partially restored, the violence has already reshaped realities on the ground. Protest networks are disrupted, fear is institutionalized, and the regime has demonstrated its willingness to escalate without restraint. Intelligence that arrives late and cautious does not prevent outcomes. It merely documents them after the fact. The hard lesson here is one the intelligence community keeps relearning and then forgetting. When a regime cuts its own people off from the world, it is not hiding weakness, it is revealing fear. Treating information blackouts as secondary developments instead of primary indicators guarantees that assessments lag behind events. And when intelligence lags, policy follows fiction instead of fact. There is a clear threshold in internal unrest that intelligence professionals are trained to watch for, and it is the moment when a regime abandons graduated force and moves directly to lethal suppression. Once live ammunition is authorized against demonstrators, the situation is no longer a policing problem. It becomes an internal security operation governed by military logic. That threshold was crossed in Iran when eyewitness accounts described security forces engaging protesters with weapons of war, turning city streets into what participants themselves called war zones. At that point, any remaining ambiguity about the regime's intentions disappeared. From my experience, this shift reflects a calculated decision rather than panic alone. Regimes like Iran's maintain layered response doctrines for internal unrest. Initial tolerance, selective arrests, intimidation, and information control are designed to fragment opposition without triggering mass resistance. When those measures fail, the leadership faces a binary choice: negotiate legitimacy or enforce submission through violence. Iran chose enforcement. That decision tells us more about the regime's internal assessment than any official declaration ever could. What is striking is how often Western analysis hesitates to name this transition plainly. Reports speak of clashes, crackdowns, or security responses, language that blurs responsibility and disguises scale. Intelligence assessments should instead state the obvious: the state initiated lethal force against its own population to preserve power. Once that happens, casualty numbers become indicators of operational tempo, not moral shock points. Whether the dead number 3,000 or 5,000, the strategic meaning is the same. The regime has declared war on dissent. The strategic consequences extend beyond Iran's borders. When a government demonstrates that it will accept international condemnation in exchange for domestic control, it signals confidence that external pressure is manageable or meaningless. Sanctions, statements, and expressions of concern lose deterrent value when not paired with credible strategic consequences. Adversaries observe this calculus closely. So, do allied regimes face their own internal pressures? The intelligence failure here is not a lack of data, but a reluctance to integrate doctrine, precedent, and behavior into a coherent assessment. Analysts know how these systems operate. They know what live fire repression signifies. Yet assessments are often diluted to preserve policy flexibility, which in practice means policy avoidance. The hard lesson is uncomfortable but necessary. Once protest turns kinetic, the window for influence narrows dramatically. Intelligence that refuses to say this out loud does not preserve options, it guarantees irrelevance. One of the least discussed pathologies inside the intelligence community is how comfortable it has become with uncertainty when uncertainty is politically useful. I don't mean genuine gaps in collection or analysis, those are unavoidable. I'm talking about the institutional habit of elevating uncertainty into a protective shield, a way to avoid delivering assessments that force policymakers to confront consequences they would rather postpone. Iran's crackdown exposed this habit in real time. As reports of mass casualties mounted, intelligence briefings increasingly leaned on phrases like unconfirmed, difficult to verify, and fragmentary reporting. On the surface, that sounds responsible. In practice, it functioned as a delaying mechanism. The lack of perfect visibility became an excuse not to characterize the event as what it clearly was: a regime survival operation employing lethal force at scale. Analysts were not wrong about the data limitations, but they were evasive about the implications. Uncertainty was emphasized not to improve accuracy, but to soften the impact. This tendency reflects a deeper institutional incentive. Clear assessments create pressure for action. Ambiguous assessments preserve bureaucratic safety. When intelligence products avoid firm judgments, they protect agencies from political backlash and protect policymakers from having to choose between uncomfortable options. Over time, this dynamic trains analysts to hedge, even when patterns, precedent, and doctrine point decisively in one direction. Iran's behavior fit a well-documented model. Information blackouts, deployment of internal security forces, authorization of live fire, and mass detentions are not novel developments requiring extraordinary confirmation. They are established regime responses to existential unrest. Intelligence professionals are trained to assess intent and capability, not to wait for perfect casualty counts. By the time thousands are reported dead, the analytic threshold for judgment has long been crossed. The strategic consequence of this comfort with uncertainty is erosion of credibility. Allies begin to discount assessments that arrive late and hedged. Adversaries learn that Western intelligence will document atrocities cautiously but rarely frame them as strategic turning points. Most damaging of all, internal policymakers learn that intelligence can be shaped to support indecision. That is not analysis. It is narrative maintenance. The hard lesson is that uncertainty should sharpen analysis, not blunt it. When institutions hide behind verification caveats instead of integrating available evidence into clear judgments, they fail their core mission. Intelligence is not meant to be safe. It is meant to be honest, even when honesty forces decisions they would rather avoid. What followed the intelligence hedging was entirely predictable. Narrative management filled the vacuum left by analytical clarity. When assessments avoid firm judgments, policymakers and media institutions step into supply framing that feels authoritative but remains strategically empty. In Washington, the language shifted quickly from the scale of repression to the choreography of response. Statements emphasize monitoring the situation, weighing options, and supporting the Iranian people, phrases that signal concern without committing to consequences. This is not accidental. It is how narrative substitutes for strategy. Media coverage mirrored this pattern. Reporting focused on dramatic individual testimonies, intermittent connectivity, and diplomatic sound bites, while avoiding sustained analysis of what mass lethal repression actually means for regime stability and regional security. Viewers were shown fragments of truth without being given the framework to understand them. That fragmentation is useful. It allows outrage to spike and fade without demanding policy coherence. The story becomes episodic rather than structural. As someone who has watched this process from the inside, I can tell you that this convergence between government messaging and media framing is rarely coordinated, but it is deeply symbiotic. Officials rely on cautious intelligence language to justify restraint. Media outlets rely on official ambiguity to avoid definitive conclusions that might alienate sources or audiences. The result is a self-reinforcing loop in which everyone acknowledges violence, yet no one names its strategic meaning. Thousands can be killed, cities can be turned into internal battlefields, and the discussion still revolves around next steps rather than consequences already incurred. The strategic cost of this narrative management is severe. Credibility is not lost in a single moment. It erodes through repetition. When populations under repression hear expressions of concern unaccompanied by action, they recalibrate their expectations. When adversarial regimes see that mass violence triggers words instead of leverage, they update their risk calculations. When allies observe hesitation framed as prudence, they question whether alignment offers protection or merely rhetoric. The intelligence failure here is indirect but decisive. By not forcing a clear analytical frame early, intelligence institutions allow narrative actors to define reality downstream. Once that happens, policy options narrow, not because alternatives disappear, but because public justification becomes harder. The hard lesson is that narrative management is not neutral. When it replaces analysis, it becomes a strategic liability. Power respects clarity. Ambiguity invites contempt. There is a persistent illusion in Washington that restraint preserves influence. In reality, restraint without leverage signals indifference, and indifference is read as weakness by both adversaries and victims. When the United States and its partners responded to Iran's lethal crackdown with calibrated language instead of strategic consequence, they did more than fail the protesters. They clarified the limits of their own resolve. That clarification did not require a formal announcement. It was communicated through inaction. From an intelligence standpoint, this is where analysis should have shifted decisively from description to consequence mapping. A regime willing to kill thousands to maintain control has already calculated the external response and judged it tolerable. That judgment is not speculative, it is based on precedent. Iran has weathered sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and public condemnation before. When mass internal violence produces no new costs, the lesson is reinforced. Survival through force is viable. That lesson does not stay internal. It is observed across the region by actors facing their own legitimacy pressures. The strategic ripple effects are predictable. Regional partners begin hedging, seeking accommodation, or alternative security guarantees. Adversaries interpret restraint as permission to escalate elsewhere. Non-state actors learn that alignment with state power, however brutal, offers protection from meaningful intervention. Over time, this recalibration erodes deterrence, not through defeat, but through disbelief. Commitments are no longer feared because they are no longer expected to be enforced. What frustrates me most is that intelligence institutions often recognize these dynamics, but present them as abstract risks rather than imminent outcomes. Assessments warn of potential credibility costs instead of stating plainly that credibility is already being spent. By the time policymakers debate whether to act, the strategic damage has been done. Influence is not a bank account you can refill on demand. It is a reputation accumulated through consistent behavior. The human cost of this posture is often dismissed as tragic but unavoidable. That framing is itself a form of abdication. When intelligence avoids connecting internal repression to external strategic decay, it allows moral discomfort to be compartmentalized. The hard lesson is stark and uncomfortable. Looking away is not neutral. It is a strategic choice with consequences that compound over time. Power that refuses to acknowledge this becomes performative rather than real. After decades inside and around the intelligence system, I've come to accept an uncomfortable truth. Intelligence institutions do not primarily fail because they lack information. They fail because they lack the institutional courage to confront what their own information implies. The Iranian crackdown, with thousands reportedly killed as unrest expanded, was not an intelligence mystery. It was a case study in willful analytical restraint. The facts were grim, but they were not ambiguous. What was ambiguous was the willingness to draw conclusions that would force policy reckoning. The recurring pattern is always the same. Early indicators are flagged but downplayed. Escalatory signals are described but not integrated. By the time events reach an undeniable scale, intelligence products shift into retrospective documentation instead of forward-looking judgment. This creates the illusion of rigor while avoiding responsibility. Agencies can say they reported the facts, even as they avoided stating what those facts meant. That distinction may protect careers, but it does not protect national interests. Iran's response to internal dissent followed a script written long before this crisis. Information control, security force deployment, live fire authorization, and mass repression are not improvisations, they are doctrinal choices. Any seasoned analyst understands this. Yet institutional habits favor caution over clarity, especially when clarity would confront policymakers with limited and unpleasant options. Intelligence becomes descriptive rather than diagnostic. It records damage instead of warning about impact. The strategic consequence of this failure extends far beyond Iran. Every time intelligence softens its conclusions to preserve flexibility, it teaches adversaries that Western resolve is negotiable. Every time mass violence is framed as a developing situation rather than a strategic rupture, credibility erodes a little further. Over time, this erosion becomes systemic. Allies stop expecting leadership. Adversaries stop fearing consequences. Intelligence, once meant to illuminate hard truths, becomes a supporting actor in narrative maintenance. The hard lesson intelligence keeps relearning is painfully simple. Analysis that avoids discomfort is not neutrality, it is complicity. When institutions prioritize process over judgment, they surrender relevance. Intelligence is supposed to tell leaders what they do not want to hear, not what they can safely postpone. Until that function is restored, the collapse of strategic narrative will continue, not because facts are hidden, but because they are politely ignored. This is how intelligence becomes fiction, not through lies, but through silence where judgment should be.